Good evening. That's working, I think. Good evening and welcome to our first Catalyst Collaborations. Super excited for this one, no pressure. I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and I'm going to hand over to our very capable and knowledgeable presenters. We don't plan any fire alarms, so if there is one, please don't panic. We're just going to go through this exit, or we also have an exit at the back and to my right. And the assembly point is outside of the building. If I can just ask you to keep your phones on silent or vibrate so we don't have any interruptions. And then I think that is it. Oh, toilets. If you go through this room, just to the left-hand side, that will be it. Over to you.
Thanks, Claudia. So good evening, everybody. My name's Helen Poole. I'm, as it says on there, Executive Dean in the School of Justice, Security and Sustainability.
And I'm Rachel Bolton King, and I'm an Associate Professor of Forensic Science. And if you hadn't realised, our key area of research, our key area of expertise is around firearms and firearm investigations and gun crime.
So I've been at the university at Staffordshire for just over 3 years, but I met Rachel several years before that in Dubrovnik. It's a hard life, isn't it? But somebody's got to do it through our research. So we hope you enjoy this evening.
And we're going to also make it interactive. So for those that have already started to do this, that's great, fantastic. And we have tried to get you thinking about the topic of what we're going to talk about today, which is all about UK gun crime and the potential threat of DIY firearms. So we'll go into some of your thoughts around that shortly. But before we really get started with our session, we wanted to get some more of your thoughts, to get some ideas around what you think about our UK gun crime. So you've started thinking about DIY firearms and what that means to you. But if you haven't already done that, you can scan the QR code and I'll load up the next question. So, complete the following sentence with one of the following options. Gun crime in the UK has risen over the last 5 years, been quite stable over the last 5 years, fallen over the last 5 years, or fluctuated over the last 5 years. Whichever one you think is the answer, just hit that submit button and we'll get the votes in and see what people think. If anyone's streaming online, you can get involved with this as well. But if anyone's watching after the fact, unfortunately, voting will have closed. Fantastic. I'm just going to reveal the results. Okay. So overall, we're thinking that gun crime in the UK has risen over the last 5 years. Does anyone want to, who may have answered that, indicate why they think it might have risen over the last 5 years?
It might be the fact that media concentrates on that area.
Okay, so we're seeing much more recently some of the more media reports, whether it's local or national level, around firearm crime. Absolutely.
It also depends on what's actually being reported to the police, because obviously there is gun crime that happens where it's not known about, sort of thing.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm just going to interject a little bit with a little bit of a stat around the US firearm crime, is that from some of the research that they've done, between 80 and 98% of firearm discharges aren't reported to police, which is a really shocking consideration. But I'll let Helen go into a little more around this shortly.
Okay, so I just wanted to start with a bit of context about, I guess, why we're interested in gun crime, why we bother looking at this, because you might ask, in the UK context, it's not our biggest concern. However, globally, there are about 200,000 people killed in firearm homicides internationally outside of conflict zones. So those are, if you like, civilian homicides. And the knock-on effects, there are many more who are injured and have life-changing injuries. And the knock-on effects for lots of different groups in society is substantial. So one of the things that I've looked at is that impact on development. So in developing countries, which disproportionately suffer from some of these issues. Losing the breadwinner in a family, for example, can have a massive detrimental impact, and it is, by the UN standards, hampering development in some developing countries and having a massive economic impact. It also obviously has a major impact on the health service for those countries that have high levels of firearms crime. And it's not just dealing with the injured, it's also the secondary trauma that health service professionals face when they're dealing with the after effects of firearms crime. Increasingly as well, we also see firearms facilitating other types of crime. So although it might not be the primary offence, as we'll look at some stats in terms of how firearms are used in the UK context, quite often they're used to facilitate in what we call gun-enabled crime, so whether that is robberies, for example. And of course, we've seen an increasing use of firearms in terrorist attacks. Now, there are fewer terrorist attacks. They don't make up the greatest proportion of terrorist attacks, but the terrorist attacks involving firearms are more lethal than other types of terrorist attacks. So there's a project here, Project Safety, undertaken by the Flemish Peace Institute, who do a lot of research in this area, which looked at the correlation, the nexus, if you like, between firearms and terrorism. And of course, it's a big strain on criminal justice systems. So we know we've got a few problems in our criminal justice systems in the UK with backlogs, etc. And of course, having high levels of any type of crime puts further pressure in terms of costs, backlogs, and feeding through into the prison system, for example. So lots of impact. And because of this is the United Nations have made it one of the foci of their Sustainable Development Goals. So by 2030, so target 16.4 of the Sustainable Development Goals is to significantly reduce illicit arms flows as well as financial flows. And so a few years ago, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime launched something called Education for Justice. And it's the only crime, well, organised crime is in there, but it's the only crime type that has its own presence in terms of the Education for Justice university modules, or tertiary modules as they're called. And it's actually myself and some colleagues who wrote the materials for this, which are available online. So it's the UN recognises the massive impact that firearms crime is having globally, and that's why they've dedicated a Sustainable Development Goal in this area. So, UK, you asked a question on it. I mean, it's fluctuating. It does fluctuate, and I'll go into some specific statistics in a moment. But as one of your students, I think, at the back, Rachel, pointed out, there's a lot of unreported firearms crime. And one of the reasons, of course, is that the victims are often perpetrators of other types of crime, so they're involved in gangs, etc. So we don't know the precise extent of firearms crime, but the ONS statistics, if you go on to the next one, I'm doing my Chris Whitty here. What we do know from the stats to March 2021 is that there were 35 homicides by shooting in the UK across that period. Does that surprise you as low? Did you think it was higher? Or was that what you would have guessed? So homicides by firearms are only 6% of homicides, so it only accounts for 6% of firearms. As I'm sure you're aware from the news, you're way more likely to die from being stabbed than you are from being shot in the UK context. And most of the victims are male, and that's to do with the lifestyle that those people are involved with. However, we don't have the official statistics published to March 22, but it's reported that the Metropolitan Police alone have seen 38 firearms murders in the last year, and this has been in the news recently as there have been a number of firearms incidents. There are about 5,700 firearms offences a year if you take out non-air weapon offences, a large proportion of which tend to be criminal damage, and 40% of firearms offences involve violence against the person. So that's not necessarily shooting. You might use it as a club, or you might use it to threaten and intimidate somebody. 16% of offences are accounted for through robberies, and 15% are attempted murders. 10%, as I said, is criminal damage, and this is largely air weapons. Surprisingly, I suppose in a way that, well, this was from the 2021 stats. They might look very different for the 22 stats. That's the other thing. These things are always moving. But although the metropolitan area has the largest number of offences per 100,000 of the population, which is what we use as an indicator of crime levels, the highest, don't worry walking home tonight, but per 100,000 of the population, it's actually the West Midlands in that data set that had the largest number of firearms crimes.
So I asked earlier what you thought when you heard the term DIY firearm, and you had a real good range of terms that you wrote up on sort of and voted. And I saw sort of improvised, I saw homemade, and this absolutely is what DIY firearms are all about. But there are differing levels of DIY firearms, if you want to call them that. The most often that we're seeing at the moment are actually around improvised firearms. So this is something that's relatively simple, a weapon that's made that's often single shot, so it just discharges one cartridge of ammunition. This is a very big scale version of some things, and it's totally plastic. It's don't worry, it is not an illegal or an actual cartridge of ammunition, but just as a demonstrative aid. So improvised firearms, they tend to be your more homemade firearms, but as the skill level of the person creating that firearm increases, this is where they might become something called craft-produced firearms. So these are much more sophisticated usually in their design and are more capable of discharging a number of rounds or cartridges of ammunition. And very recently, there's also been a document which we helped to review and feed into that's now started to classify these terminologies around what do we mean by different types of firearm. Because there are different users of firearms. There's military, law enforcement, there's hobbyists, and there's the manufacturers, and they all have different terminologies that they use. And so this document is really starting to define as internationally as possible actually what terms we should be using, because these are often very different from the terms that are reported in the media and what we are maybe more used to hearing. One of my pet peeves is the term bullet being used to describe a cartridge case, for example. This is the cartridge case. The projectile, an example, is a bullet. Altogether is a cartridge or a round of ammunition. So the media, unfortunately, do get a lot of these terminologies incorrect as well. And there's a heavy focus, both in the media, but also in research, etc., around the firearm itself. But what's less talked about, what's less thought about, what's less researched, what's less tracked and profiled is actually the ammunition. And the ammunition is as capable and as easy to produce as the firearms itself. In different countries, for example in the US, actually casting your own projectiles, your own bullets, is a common hobby, and it's reloading ammunition. So this is where you've used a cartridge case before. You can then put more propellant inside it, put a new primer in it, new projectile, and you've got a reloaded cartridge case. Particularly for those that are target shooters, actually making their own ammunition, they're much more confident in the quality and the reliability and the accuracy of their ammunition. And so this, it's you're able to buy different component parts for ammunition and build them yourself. But obviously, depending on the laws, depending on what type of ammunition and firearms, depends on whether it's legal or not to do so. So ammunition is an under-researched, under-considered, and very acquirable commodity. So Bedfordshire Police, for example, have actually started to do much more ammunition profiling. So when firearms are recovered, they're often found with ammunition as well. So whether they've been buried, whether they're being hidden, whether they're being stored, or whether they're being sold and purchased. And I fed into the UNIDIR's new handbook that was released just a couple of years ago around helping people, practitioners, researchers, etc., on what to document, what to look at, how to interpret and profile ammunition. And so you can actually look at where the ammunition is coming from, which country of manufacture is it, who's the manufacturer, is it clandestinely or illegally made, or is it legally made and is somehow getting in to the criminal market. Their research indicates that actually 12-bore shotgun cartridges, so this is a fired one, but something like this, our shotgun ammunition, is actually the most common caliber type that they've recovered in a 10-year period between 2010 and 2020. But also blank firing or starter pistol kind of cartridges are actually being converted, and they're also linked to gang-related crime.
Okay, so as well as craft-produced weapons, we've got this phenomenon that's broadly known as ghost guns, and I guess what might fall into ghost guns are three main types. So 3D printed firearms that are fully 3D printed, composite firearms which are a bit of a hybrid and involve other parts apart from the 3D printed parts, and PMFs, or buy, build and shoot firearms, which we've seen a particular issue in the US in the last couple of years. So ARES again, you see their publications a lot. We're also supervising their director for his PhD, so we're very familiar with Nick's work. But what ARES have done here, sorry, tell Nick we gave him a shout out, is kind of looked at these three different types, the fully 3D, the hybrid, and the parts kit completion, is what PKC stands for, and looked at how viable they are as weapons on the basis of their durability, their capability, how easy they are to produce, the accessibility of parts, and the cost. And you'll see that they become more viable, more able to shoot multiple rounds, etc., sort of the more expensive they get. So these hybrid are a mix of 3D printed and other unregulated components, whereas the parts kits are slightly different, where they commercially buy regulated parts and then commonly produce the frame or receiver from through 3D printing. So we can see fully 3D printed, they're cheap and are accessible, but they have low capability. And this is really what came out from a piece of research Rachel and I did with a project student a couple of years ago. And he interviewed a number of stakeholders from law enforcement agencies, the UN, a few other places, and asked them about their views about what risk do 3D printed weapons. Because certainly when I started looking at firearms, I was told in no uncertain terms by certain agencies in law enforcement that there was no credible threat from 3D printed weapons, and that may well have been true at that point. One of the points made to me was they're not very credible. What self-respecting gangster wants to be seen running around with a little blue plastic gun? So that was one of the points made to me. But actually it was more about their lethality, about the amount of velocity the propellant could get, it'd be compromised by the materials, that they weren't durable and reliable. And this quote here that one of the participants in the research gave to our student was, police tested one in their ballistics lab and it basically blew apart after about 3 shots. So it's not really a viable weapon. And so the view very much was that there was much harm or much danger to the user as there would be to any potential victim. And another issue that restricted their threat level was the lack of availability of suitable ammunition. Anyway, if you can get your hands on other types of weapons on the streets, why would you bother printing your own 3D printed firearm? However, on the other side, and we'll look at how some of these areas have developed later on, they are increasingly cheaper to produce, with printers and materials reducing in price. You don't need an awful lot of technical knowledge in order to produce them, and you can get the design templates, as we've seen with the Liberator. It was taken down, but not before God knows how many people had downloaded it. They are available on the internet and also the dark web. They have certain advantages. So plastic weapons are undetectable if they're fully plastic by metal detectors, increasing the potential for trafficking. And it used to be said you can melt one down after you've used it and there's no trace. But more to the point, what you can produce today, as this quote says, far outstrips the capabilities and durability and safety of those designs from 7 years ago. Another benefit that Rachel will go into in more depth is it's much more challenging to forensically identify and analyse these firearms. But in particular, what we've seen is, as I mentioned before, these hybrid firearms, which are far more viable, where they use a mixture of metal and printed parts and other parts. So we've got to a stage where we're producing semi-automatic pistols with 3D printed parts that can fire thousands of rounds and still retain their integrity. Personally manufactured firearms, this is what's been a particular issue in the US. They are untraceable firearms because they don't have serial numbers. So the person wanting to acquire the firearm can buy the pieces online, can assemble them together, and in a very short period of time, they're quite easy to put together. They take less than half an hour. And you might find it surprising that the problem sits in America, but believe it or not, some states have stricter laws than others, and in particular, children cannot legally purchase firearms. So, but they can, and they have been shown to be putting together PMFs and using them. So this has been a particular issue, as I said, in the US. It has been described as the modern equivalent of filing off serial numbers after you've stolen a firearm. And as I said, they're readily assembled in no time at all. So I've just got a few examples here. This is a quote around California and where they've seen a particular issue here. They're untraceable, assembled from parts, and can be ordered by gang members, felons, and even children. They're increasingly the lethal weapon of easy access around the US, but especially California. So between 1.25% of all the firearms seized in California in 2021 were ghost guns, and about 20,000 were seized across the US in that same year. So these are just a few examples. Ghost guns have been used in school shootings. They've been used in domestic homicides here, father killing his 3 daughters. Down the bottom, we have a right-wing attack that was launched on a synagogue in Germany. And after attacking the synagogue, the offender shot at passers-by, a number of people injured. And also, actually, this is a little old by comparison now, but probably about 18 months ago, a big 3D printed gun factory was uncovered in Tenerife. So it's not just the US, it is happening in Europe as well. And of course, we're not immune from that.
So let's consider some of the more easy to produce improvised firearms. Welcome the slam gun. This is not new. This design has been around since World War II, but has been increasingly shared, let's say, as a design mechanism. And we are seeing it used more often in the UK, particularly around recoveries and seizures of slam guns is increasing. Just out of interest for those in the audience, put your hands up if you've seen a news report about or ever seen the word slam gun. Okay, so a few, but actually not as many as I thought, which is surprising, but probably just because of the kind of field I work in. I probably see it in the news a little bit more often. Well, technically, these are just, again, plastic versions, so there's no credible threat here, and it's a completely fired, so not live ammunition that I'm using in as demonstrative aid. But ultimately, a slam gun is a piece of tube that you can buy in the DIY shop. I've bought a plumber's part, but any part that resembles something else that will basically fit your shotgun cartridge, so primarily shotgun cartridges being utilized, into the end. This then becomes the chamber, which is then supported by the receiver. The two, usually you have a longer handle or grip, but basically you take the receiver end, you take the barrel with your loaded shotgun cartridge, and you slam the two together. Hence the reason it's called a slam gun. The other crucial thing about my receiver is there is no firing pin. So even if it was live ammunition, it wouldn't be doing an awful lot anyway. So, very, very simple construction of welding, basically metal components and pipes together. So you can see the difference on the screen between, on the image on your right-hand side, you've got two parts. The part on the left-hand side of the West Midlands Police logo, you've got an improvised firearm, a slam gun. On the right-hand side, you've got your conventional firearm. The issue that we have in terms of a law enforcement and a legality perspective is, well, I've just got bits of pipe and tube. How does that legally classify it as being a prohibited weapon or being a firearm in terms of the law? And this is, again, one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in the prevalence and the recovery, I think, of these particular firearms. So what types of crime are they being used for in the UK? Definitely discharging shotgun ammunition with these homemade slam guns from criminal damage perspective, but also in attempted murders and murders as well. What about the ammunition? Yeah, shotgun cartridges are much more easily accessible in the UK. There's less restriction around the ownership of them. However, they are also improvising shotgun cartridges. So taking cartridges and cartridge cases that have been previously fired and basically putting any old bit of metal in there that could act as a projectile or multiple. Also utilizing paper, cardboard, cotton wool, whatever, to pad out basically the propellant compared to the projectile. So they've been recovered in casework. We've also got the Paul Edmonds case where he was buying legal firearms, antique weapons, before they changed the law, and basically converting and improvising the ammunition that was available so that then it would fire in these antique weapons. And so, again, the less talked about, but really important to consider the availability, the source of the ammunition for use in both these homemade or these improvised firearms, as well as any firearms that are antique weapons that could be made to fire a lethal round. So Helen mentioned earlier the dangers. The picture on the left is actually a real slam gun that was manufactured and found in Nottingham last month, October. And this weapon actually shot off part of the hand of the shooter. So this is the real danger associated with these slam guns. However, on the other side, you can manufacture quite easily a very robust slam gun, which is much more capable of discharging numerous rounds without any harm to the user. And again, I've seen these in action. The one on the right is an example of a 3D printed Liberator gun that was printed by the ATF when the Liberator blueprints were sort of exposed, and really demonstrating its explosive nature when you tried to discharge real ammunition through it. So really dangerous. In terms of the impact the other side, a shotgun cartridge, hands up if you've ever done clay pigeon shooting or shot a shotgun gone hunting, something like that. They've got a pretty good kick.
Yes.
Yeah. The amount of energy of all those projectiles is high. Just because you surround that cartridge with a relatively basic piece of metal, it's still going to have that potential lethality from that ammunition. This was a piece of research that Durham Police, and in collaboration with NABIS and ourselves, are doing at the moment. And this was the test firing that was undertaken, and the wooden backboard, you can see the impact damage from about sort of 6 to 10 meters away. Still a large amount of the shot staying together, basically creating a big hole in our wooden target. So, a little bit more info. So, next question. So if you've still got your Woo Clap open, that's great. If not, you can just rescan the code and it should load back up for you. So I'll just leave that there for a moment. Helen mentioned earlier about the price of these illegal weapons.
You just reminded me of a story of somebody from the police service of Northern Ireland told me, thinking about slam guns blowing your hand off, about how some loyalist terrorists had heard that if you grind down the gunpowder out of fireworks, that you get more of a blast. So they put it in a NutriBlend. Apparently, fortunately for them, put it in a NutriBlend. Fortunately for them, they hadn't turned the switch on in the kitchen. So he went into the kitchen, turned the switch on. Apparently, you could see it from across most of Northern Ireland, the fireworks display after that. He was very lucky to escape that one.
Okay, so we're interested what you think. How much do you think it costs to buy an illegal firearm with ammunition? I'm using the term an illegal firearm. So whatever you think, whatever type of illegal firearm you are imagining here. I like hearing the discussions that are going on. That's why I'm so silent. Because the answers that come up here aren't necessarily what you guys are saying. I'll give it another few seconds and we'll have a look. Let's reveal, oh, some good variability here. Okay, so £100 for the firearm.
50s.
50.
25.
25 quid. 30 quid, 900 quid. 500 pounds.
£10.
Upwards of 200. 15 to 20k. Wow. That's going to be some very rich criminals there. But then again, you never know, to be fair.
There was a very expensive one on the Antiques Roadshow.
Yes, and that absolutely does have an impact. on the price. So yeah, it's all about availability and demand.
So just a few days ago, really, the Commissioner, Mark Rowley of the Metropolitan Police, reported that you could buy a firearm on the streets of London for £200 to £300. So some of you are a lot lower, some are a lot higher. It's estimated you can print a 3D weapon for about £160. This is a kosher website where you can buy deactivated weapons, which doesn't take the brains of Britain to reactivate in many cases. They go for £500 upwards, depending on the collectability. And in the Paul Edmonds case, an antique firearm with craft-produced ammunition was sold for £3,000.
Yeah, well, that's what it reported it to be. If it's not right, I apologise, but that's the media for you and open source information. So yeah, the availability of firearms, the availability of ammunition, it fluctuates. Sometimes there's a lot of it, both in demand and in terms of their availability. Sometimes they're not. And as a result, this will, like anything we all know in this day and age, it has a massive impact on the price of what you're looking for and what you might need. In terms of those investigative challenges then, so the more commercially produced firearms, gladly, they produce a lot of forensic evidence. They are quite repeatable, they're very reliable because they're made to very good standards, generally speaking, even the ones that are relatively low quality and cheap. We can forensically analyze them, we can connect multiple shootings and discharges across the world if you've got the right equipment to do so. Then as you become more and more down the 3D print or down to fully printed weapons, they do become more and more difficult to investigate, to trace, to make that unique. It was that gun as opposed to another gun. When it comes to the improvised and the craft produced, it massively depends on the quality and the level of sophistication of the actual weapon itself as to where in that process and that hierarchy it might sit. So in terms of some of those things that are quite challenging, with commercially produced firearms, you will often get serial numbered components, as Helen mentioned earlier. But with anything that's been improvised or homemade, you're not going to get those serial numbers, which means there's no traceability for where it was purchased, who manufactured it, where it was sold to. You've got not necessarily an idea as to the starting point of the chain. You don't know whether it was made in this country or another country. You don't know if it was trafficked from one country across a border to another country. But on the flip side, there is this ability to have a look at kind of the way in which they're manufactured. Because individuals will have a certain style of production, a style of manufacture. They will utilize certain tools that, again, have that ability to group similarly made firearms or weapons or parts together so that the intelligence can suggest and the evidence can build that a particular person may be producing these weapons. Or another person might be the transfer, the person where the actual firearm or the ammunition is actually moved through. So the manufacturer themselves, the criminal armourer or whatever, may not actually get involved with the end user, the purchaser, but they act through a third party. So there's no ownership records that they can track. Our illicit arms and tracing record management system, so this is part of the firearm toolkit that's produced by Interpol, can't be used because there's no serial numbers, we can't trace them. So we're more reliant on those financial transactions that may occur. So your receipts for purchasing the component parts that you may have been used to actually produce a slam gun, or the welding equipment, or the tool marks that were used the saws or whatever that might have been used in that production. When it comes to forensic ballistics, I've put ballistics in there because it's a term that's always referred to, and ballistics doesn't actually mean the same thing as firearm identification, but anyway. Ammunition and firearms, as I mentioned, they're quite variable in how they've been manufactured. They can produce some quite unusual marks on the ammunition when it's been fired. And those unusual marks may come from the production of those SLAM guns or those improvised firearms or those craft-produced firearms. They can be unusual because the cartridge, when the projectiles are fired, they don't fit very well necessarily within the original or within the component parts. And so they might bounce around, or they might not make very good contact, they might not seal very well. And this can create quite variable outputs, so the impact on the target, whether that's a person, an animal, or an object. On the other hand, when they are quite well made, or they've been very crudely made with lots of tool marks left on the surface, this is great for us because then we do have lots of repeatable and quite reliable marks that we can utilize for forensic comparison purposes. Some of the indicators also on the fired cartridge cases might be that the cartridge case is kind of bulging. It might have actually ruptured or fractured. And this can be an indicator that the ammunition has been put in a firearm that has been modified, or it's improvised, or it's not been designed for that ammunition in some way. There can also be quite heavy marks. So, for example, the firing pin that I mentioned, that's the bit that actually hits the base of the cartridge case and initiates the ignition of the ammunition. If these are too long, they can actually pierce the primer, so they basically create a hole in the end. So again, indicators that they've actually been not well designed, or the ammunition itself is incorrect for it. Or they can be very light markings to the extent we can't even see them. So there can be some real challenges. Some of the research that we've done, as I mentioned, with Durham Police and NABIS, our National Ballistics Intelligence Service, we noticed that the firearms, or the SLAM guns that were produced for that research, actually generated some very distinctive tool marks. And each of the receivers that were made generated different tool marks from one receiver to the other. So each of these parts had different markings. The chamber areas of the barrel, again, had different markings. And the actual firing pin impression that was created in the actual primer cap was very distinctive. And this was the actual screw thread and the tool marks were actually transferred, and each of the individual firing pins were very different in their markings from one to the other, even though it was the same batch of metal and parts that were utilized to make all of the repeats that we created. And again, they had these quite deep firing pin impressions that actually made it quite challenging for the 3D imaging systems to capture, because they weren't designed to image that deep into a hole. But working with the manufacturers was brilliant, because we were able to actually improve and expand the actual depth of imaging and focus. And so in other casework, they'll be able to capture the full depth of those firing pin impressions now. There are other indicators as well, so things like the amount of unburnt propellant flakes that might be found at a crime scene, or on some clothing, or on an object. The actual projectiles, so bullets, for example, if they're not stable through air, if the firearm like this isn't a rifled barrel, then the actual projectiles might tumble in the air and they might hit side on. So again, indicative of there's something not quite right with how the ammunition was discharged. You might also, if it was a 3D printed firearm, you might have traces of that polymer, that 3D print material with fragments. Even if that firearm stays intact, they might be actually embedded in the projectile or on the cartridge case, or they might be found in the actual crime scene themselves. So, or even in a gunshot wound, things like that. And so there actually needs to be some reconsideration, I think, about, and this is also supported by research externally, that the way in which we then investigate and we actually search and recover the forensic evidence from firearms when they've been improvised and craft produced actually might need to change. So there's lots of potential areas for research there as well. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier was around like, well, okay, there are bits of pipe, there are bits of metal tube. Well, how do we know, why are we going to call them a firearm? If you have a Section 5 prohibited firearm, it's a mandatory 7 years in prison now for possessing it. So how do we then, knowing that these things, how do we prove that these objects are in fact slam gun component parts? One of the things that we've done, and there is casework that utilises this, is actually look at doing a swab of the inside of the barrel for gunshot residue. And so the fact that you can find characteristic gunshot residue particles on the inside of the firearm, whether it's inside the receiver or inside the barrel, could give you that indicator that this part, this pipe, whatever the suspect may be saying that this was for, may actually have evidence that it's been used to discharge primed ammunition as opposed to things like fireworks, because they are distinctly different. We've been doing some research as to what's the best way to gather that evidence from there. Because of the design of some of the alternative sampling methods, the swab is the most effective way at the moment, but we know if we could redesign a stub, because of the internal dimensions, you can't get a stub in there very easily, which has basically got like an adhesive surface on it, which is what we would use to sample gunshot residue from like hands of suspects, things like that. We can't do that on the inside very easily, so we'd need to make some form of adaptive device in order to help us facilitate and extract that gunshot residue and make the actual analysis a much more efficient and effective. But we can absolutely do that analysis. And also, if you've got any fired cartridge cases that are found at the crime scene or found on suspects, or you've got live ammunition that hasn't yet been fired and it's been supplied with a part, again, you could potentially test fire and see whether the composition is similar. It's not going to be unique to any particular cartridge. We can't do that, but we can at least rule out it was produced by this ammunition manufacturer or it wasn't produced by this ammunition manufacturer.
So, is there a rise? I nearly put a question mark after that rising threat, but we are obviously seeing these improvised weapons being used in more and more circumstances. Cleveland police here have suggested that these weapons are linked to drugs and rival gangs related crime. And on Friday, as you can see here, the biggest ever haul of improvised firearms were found in Nottingham, not far from where you live, Rachel. I'm not drawing any links there. As well as shotgun cartridges alongside that. So it does seem to be an emerging area that we know that agencies are looking at the threat posed by this at this very time.
Definitely. And, you know, some of the other research more broadly that we've been doing across the last couple of years with students at the university, with NABIS and with our with Staffordshire Police as part of our Staffordshire Forensic Partnership has been looking at particularly police officers' awareness around firearms, around the terms like improvised blank firing weapons, around what do we call ballistic material? What does that mean? What does it include? And there's definite disparity in people's level of understanding behind these terms. So ballistic material could cover any of the things that we've talked about today. Anything that's been fired, any part of a firearm. It could be the equipment that has been used to manufacture them. And so, like, the firearm-related evidence is much, much broader than most people are aware of. And when we asked police officers and also those working within the investigation of firearm crime, we asked whether they felt that their training and awareness around firearm-related evidence was high enough. And more than half said they felt that it either wasn't or they weren't sure it was. And so that I and our colleagues, both across the UK, but also across the world, because the work we've done in Sweden as well has also indicated that officers' awareness of what firearms are, what ammunition is, what firearm-related evidence is not as high as it could be, which indicates that we're potentially missing and not maximising the amount of potential forensic evidence, but also the investigative and the intelligence links that could be made between the criminal use of firearms, the criminal use of ammunition. And where I think this is a particular concern is that with the forces that have had higher levels of gun crime for donkey's years, they're much more aware, they've got much greater levels of training, and they have much greater knowledge and awareness about this and how to investigate firearm crime. But we've also seen forces where they've had very low levels of firearm crime over a matter of a year or so have real increases in firearm crime. So forces that were much lower down the list in terms of their number of firearm-related offences over, per 100,000 of the population have gone from being down here to all of a sudden being up here. But if they don't have that knowledge and awareness that they feel they need to help investigate it and make their society safer, etc., we want to be able to stop that. We want to be able to prevent that disparity. And as a university, we want to be able to support practitioners. We want to be able to support law enforcement about doing the research that's necessary, but also about supporting and helping them with the training and evaluating the change of whether, providing training or changing the workflow of how firearm crime is investigated. If we can actually evaluate that change and we can actually evidence whether it has had an impact, whether it is making a difference, then that also then will support other areas to improve with their training and awareness as well. So thank you very much for listening, for coming. Does anyone have any questions?
There are roving mics around the place for any questions.
I just wanted to say thank you very much because it was super interesting, and I'm sure we will have loads of questions. So whoever is brave first.
Great.
I think this one's for Rachel, particularly with regard to airport security and all the scanners that they have and everything. How much of a threat are these 3D printed guns?
Okay, so I laughed a little bit earlier in my head when Helen said that they were like undetectable, because that is absolutely what them. Yeah, that's what the media says, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're undetectable, and well, they're clearly detectable because they're real items, so you can see them on an X-ray, but then less obvious to the user. And I personally don't think that there is enough training for X-ray operatives, viewers, on detecting threats from 3D printed firearms, because much of their training, as I've been informed, is very much focused on the threats that they're trying to prevent coming through, like the big scissors, and objects that are very identifiable as being items you can't take on a plane. But as soon as you change the angle of what you're viewing at, if you go from looking at something like this to something like this, it becomes harder to spot. If you change something that's metallic, that's really bright white in an X-ray image, and then it becomes more opaque or slightly less obvious because it's plastic, not metal, becomes harder to see. And, when you actually break apart those parts of the firearm and separate them out, they no longer look like a firearm. So the threat from them, I think, is potentially quite high. Firearms do come in both across land, across sea, across the air, and they're not always detected, whether it's through X-ray scanners, whether it's through physical examinations.
I think it's important to dispel this Lords of War kind of image of a plane packed to the rafters with guns coming across. What we actually have is something some people have referred to as the ant trade, where you've got an entire shipping container and there'll be a load of clothes in it and then a couple of guns discreetly deposited in it as well. So it's, but they come through the post. I live in Coventry. Coventry Airport is one of the well-known places, and Coventry Sorting Centre for parts to come in. Yeah. So there's all kinds of different ways. And again, it's about upskilling the people working in those areas to spot the signs.
And prison service as well, So there's absolute capability for fully commercially made, fully metallic firearms and ammunition to come in as easily as 3D printed ones.
I think he was next.
Hi. Sorry. You mentioned something. You said owning something could get you 7 years imprisonment. I didn't get that. Is that the slam gun or something?
Schedule 5 firearms.
Yeah, so Section 5 prohibited firearms, if you have an illegal Section 5 prohibited firearm like a semi-automatic pistol, it's a mandatory 7 years in prison. It was 5 years, it's now gone up to 7.
Yeah, I'm an ex-Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers armourer. I've got access to a lathe, all that kind of stuff. I currently manufacture, within all the legal guidance, replicas for the TV and film industry. I was just wondering if anything's going to be... Are you going to get to a point where people with a lathe are going to be put on a list, if that makes sense? I mean, my grandfather had multiple plans for Sten guns that were distributed during the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So people that had lathes and whatnot were encouraged to manufacture firearm parts, as well as other pamphlets and stuff like that. Obviously I've got absolutely no legal, I'm a, legal shooter. I just wondered if, that was something that was becoming more of a problem, because firearms have been around for 800-900 years. They're not exactly the height of technology, so they're a very simple bit of kit to make. To me, that just seems like a bit more of a problem than 3D stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, my personal opinion is I completely agree with you. In the sense that there are so many more easily accessible and producible things, but I worry that we're going to legislate things that ultimately, in my opinion, criminals, if they want access to firearms, they're going to get access to firearms. If they want to make firearms, buy firearms, convert them, reactivate them, they're going to do that. Legislation often impacts those that are legally using them, but one of the things I think that we do have to be aware of is that many of the firearms in the UK were legal firearms that then happened to be used illegally. So they somehow go from that legal purchase, everything is fine, to very quickly being stolen or being repurposed. And so, yeah, we absolutely have to be aware and acknowledge that, you know, there are so many engineers that exist, you know, and that 99.9% of them are doing everything legally, you know, whether they're in the firearms sector or not. But those that aren't, we need to be more aware about how to identify that that is a criminal act that might be happening, a criminal manufacturing facility, rather than, yeah, absolutely doing something that's totally legal, totally within our... I'm not aware of any changes at the moment.
That's what I was going to say. You started off saying, do you think there's a danger? I'm not hearing anything like that, but then I wouldn't know.
Not, luckily, let's hope not.
I had a Smith & Wesson Model 3 in for Russian. They very quietly took it off the obsolete cargo list, and that was worth £1,500 to £2,000, and it was suddenly worth zero. With no compensation. Obviously, that's the hand in. They just tend to be doing things quite quietly. So.
I wasn't, you know, it was only because I was in the know that I really was aware that there were gun amnesties this year. I mean, why we're not doing much more to advertise these gun amnesties, but also, yeah, you know, particularly around the antique firearms that, you know, are really, really expensive, you know, and they actually mean a lot to people as well, you know, for them to just, I know they don't do it, you know, on a whim. I know it's when there are credible threats that changes. But yeah, it does have a big impact on those legal owners and users.
We have time for one more question, and then we will have to finish, I'm afraid.
It's me.
That's all good.
A bit of a thingy question. I was just wondering if you're currently doing any research, because I've got to, obviously I'm doing my SONA points now. I was just wondering if you're doing anything for students anytime soon. Obviously I know we can't do anything like about using firearms or anything, but if you're doing any research at all.
Yeah, what's after is what I'd say to that
definitely.
one.
Yeah, I mean, we're really fortunate that we have technology that we're helping technology providers to evaluate, to improve, as I mentioned earlier. So we've done some work with Evo Finder. That was the one that we had on the screen earlier, but we've also got a ballistics IQ system which we're supporting the development of, which is a ballistics triage tool. But yeah, there's always research projects. I mean, it's one of the most, when you think about forensic science broadly, it's one of the most under-researched fields in terms of the new publications that come out of research. And that's often because the firearm experts are practitioners and they just don't have the time to write and publish the research that's happening compared to other forensic disciplines. So yeah, we're always calling out for more researchers in this field.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if we can just last round of applause for our presenters.
And if anyone wants to have a look at our 3D printed stuff that we've done at the university, you're more than welcome to.